welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate this morning to be sitting down with Sam Billingham, and Sam, amongst many other things, is founder of Stronger Beginnings. And as I always like to do, I like to hand over to my very special guest and let them explain a bit more about why they do what they do. So good morning, Sam.
Morning, Lucy. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, so Stronger Beginnings, how did that come about?
Yes, so thank you so much for the opportunity today. I thought I'd just dip in and out to let you all know about the work that I'm doing. So I'm the founder of Stronger Beginnings, which is an organisation that offers and delivers bespoke training packages for professionals and businesses. It's to help enhance their understanding and knowledge of coercive control, domestic abuse and its impact. I'm actually a survivor of domestic abuse. And I'll be really, really honest, I didn't have a clue what it was, even though I was experiencing it at the time. I didn't have a clue what it was until I found the strength to escape that situation. And I was handed a questionnaire, which I now believe was from Women's Aid. And I just remember looking at this questionnaire and answering yes to all the questions. And it really, really upset me at that point because it was all about control. And I didn't realise how controlled I'd actually been in that situation. I'd never heard of domestic abuse at the time. So we're talking early 2000s.
Right.
And lots of things have changed where coercive control is concerned now. So we've obviously got the coercive control law, which came out in 2015. But back then I just didn't have a clue. And it was just the realisation of everything that I'd existed through had such a massive impact on my life. And even today, as I'm sitting here with you, it still has a huge impact on my life as a survivor. So Stronger Beginnings and the work that I do is all around raising coercive control awareness. It's one of my passions at the moment because I feel that a lot of us, in general, we don't really understand what coercive control is and we don't know what it is. It's something that I strongly believe that it's there at the beginning and it's there at the end. And for those of you that know me, and I said this a lot yesterday, I was at a conference yesterday, but if you're not talking about coercive control, we're not talking about domestic abuse, because that's how it starts. So for me, when I met him in that pub, if he'd have just punched me in the face on the first night we met, would never have had a second date. It would have been all over. But no, he was very charming, he was very caring, he seemed to hang on every word I said, he seemed to have a real keen interest in my life. But looking back, I now believe that that's when the abuse started, because I felt so safe in his presence. And like we do generally when we meet people anyway, we tell them where we live, you know, what we do for a living and about our relationships with our family and friends. And those were the three things that he really took away from me when I moved into his flat with him just 2 weeks after meeting him, which is a very massive, huge, big red flag. We've got love bombing, which happens very quickly. But again, in the midst of it all, you just don't see those things. You just kind of accept it as normal and you just go along with the flow, I guess. But again, he was very, very charming, very caring. And it all started with a simple conversation along the lines of, I'm going to see your mum tonight. And it was all at the honeymoon period of the relationship when everything's exciting and you can't get enough of each other anyway. So who was I to kind of question that? I just didn't go and see my mum. But very quickly after that, every time I did try and go and see my mum or phone her, there was always a consequence. I often say, yes, I could have gone to see my mum. Yes, I could have gone out with friends, but there was always a consequence to pay once I got back. So that could be verbal abuse, physical abuse. And sometimes it's just easier not to do those normal things that we've always done because the consequences were horrific. So that very, very quickly became my norm. We learn, like a lot of other survivors, we learn how to stay safe. So if not going to see my mum or going out keeps me safe, then I'm not going to go and do those things. So it was an extremely controlling relationship that I existed in for 3 years. He would time me when I went to the toilet. He would literally stand outside the toilet door looking at his watch going, who have you been texting? I couldn't even have a bath on my own. He would physically get inside the bath with me. The only place I could go on my own was shopping, but then I was always bombarded with phone calls and text messages wanting to know
you're going to be.
Yeah. So when I met him, I was a legal secretary. You know, life for me when I met him was really, really good. And it started off with him saying very odd things that you just kind of brush off because they don't really make sense and you don't want to question it because it just doesn't make sense. So he would often say, the only way I got my job was by sleeping with my boss because I was early 20s. And I just found it really odd, very bizarre thing to say. He'd never had a job, he'd never worked. So I just kind of thought, oh, a bit odd, but you know.
Niggles you, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then he locked me in the flat one morning because he didn't want me to go to work and I couldn't get out. He'd throw the mobile phone out the 7th floor window, so I couldn't even phone in and pull a sickie, nothing like that. When I managed to get free and go back to the workplace, I was trying so hard to explain to my boss what was happening, but it was really difficult because, again, we're still in the very early stages and I didn't understand myself what was happening. So to explain it to somebody else was really hard. And again, because it was coercive control and no physical injuries, I guess it was hard for my boss to kind of accept and understand. But through his lack of understanding, I was actually instantly sacked. I was sacked on the spot, even though I was very good at my job. I loved my job. No questions asked. He just threw his arms up in the air and said, I don't want to know, don't want to listen, you're sacked. And it was at that point where I was still very, I hate this word, but I was very vulnerable. I didn't really know what was happening, so I wasn't strong enough to kind of question his decision. But when I got back home, that is when all the controlling behaviour really started. Absolutely. So if my boss at the time had just took the time just to kind of take me into his office, make me a cup of tea and just listen to me, it would have made a huge, huge difference. And that's when I kind of lost who I was. I lost Sam. I lost my sense of identity, my purpose and my belonging. So when the perpetrator was very controlling, you lose your self-worth very, very quickly. Absolutely. Because when you've been working for someone and you expect them to know you, I was never late, never had a day off, always did my work. In a way, he's kind of confirming what the perpetrator's been saying, because now he's kind of just dismissed me. So, well, it must be me, it must be something I do.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, I never opened up to anybody else after that point, because I just felt, what's the point? If my boss isn't going to listen or believe me, who else will? So those 3 years were very long, very lonely, very scary, constantly walking on eggshells. I'd always have very strict instructions not to answer the door to anyone. I couldn't have visitors in when he was out. And it was just very, very controlling, but very quickly it became my norm. And I never spoke to anyone about it because I thought it happened in all relationships. I just thought, okay, this is it. This was kind of the first real relationship I'd ever had. I've got nothing to base it on. So I just thought, oh, okay, I'll accept and tolerate this behaviour as normal. But it was only when I found the strength to kind of leave that situation that I learned, once you start having these conversations, there's so many men and women out there who either know someone who's going through it or been through it, or they are a survivor themselves. So in November 2006, he split my lip open whilst I was holding our 10-month-old daughter in my arms. I knew his behaviour wasn't going to change. I knew it was me that had to do something. So that's when I made my very final police statement. And that's when I kind of left that situation. But then you've got the family courts that come into play, because he was obviously losing that power and control over me. He wanted to regain that power and control. So we went through the family court. That was the most horrific and scary part of the cycle, because he told me what he was going to do before he actually did it. He told me he was going to get taken off me. He told me I was a crap mom. And then when you go through family court again, you believe everything you've been brainwashed and manipulated into believing. But it was thrown out of court. Luckily, the judges could see through everything, and it was thrown out of court. And then in 2009, I decided to set up SODA. SODA stands for Survivors of Domestic Abuse, and it's an online safe haven for men and women to come together who've experienced domestic abuse, because I find it's really difficult to open up to friends, family and colleagues who are lucky enough to have not experienced that. So it's a safe haven for anyone to come into the group from across the country. There's no postcode lottery, there's no criteria, there's no massive waiting list. And we've got around about 500 members worldwide, and it's quite active and they support themselves without really realising. And it's so powerful and empowering to see that these people have come together from one horrific crime and they're all here kind of supporting each other. It's kind of magnificent to see. So I've done lots of raising awareness over the last 20 years. Really, it's been a real big passion. But the last 6 months or so, my biggest passion is raising coercive control awareness, and that's kind of where Stronger Beginnings has come, because I feel survivors and professionals, we have to have those stronger beginnings and those connections together, so we can then support survivors who we work with and who we support. And I think the biggest thing that any of us can do for a survivor is raise that awareness. So we have to educate ourselves in order to be able to support survivors. So the packages I offer mainly around coercive control, but also the impact. Because I think all too often as well, we raise the awareness and we talk about our lived experience, which is really powerful and really good. But then what happens when we do leave those situations? And it's not nice. When you leave those situations, life doesn't go back to how it was before domestic abuse, and life can be pretty crappy. You really have good days and you really have bad days, and those bad days can consist of triggers. So they, for example, there could be, I don't know, a certain date, something you see on the telly, a song, and it can bring something back so quickly without any warning. I remember one of the first ones I had, and they're really, really scary, because again, you're not in control of those feelings that you're having. So for me, one of the first ones was I actually physically weed myself when I first saw him after I'd escaped that situation. He couldn't see me, but I could quite clearly see him, and my body just kind of froze without fear, because obviously I know what he's capable of, I know what he could do, and even if he just looked at me or spoke to me, it would still have that impact. And it was one of the worst triggers I had. And then it had a massive impact on my mental health as well, because I was one of these who I just plow all my time into soda and supporting everybody else and raising this awareness, that I'd actually forgot myself and my own mental health. And I had a massive breakdown where I had to learn to take a step back and focus on myself. I found that part of the journey really difficult, because he'd always told me I was ugly, I was worthless, nobody likes me, nobody's going to like you. So it took me a long time to even look in the mirror. I've only just started going out again. I've only just started getting my hair done because of the things he said. So when we do talk about coercive control, it's really important to talk about the impact, because that's when we can get lost, if that makes sense. So we could meet somebody, and I'm always really early. I have a massive insecurity about time, because when I was late in that situation, there was always a consequence. So that is still ingrained, not as bad as it was, but it's still ingrained in me. So for someone who doesn't understand where that comes from, so for example, I was at an event and one lady said, "Oh, you're always really early," but obviously she didn't understand why I was really early. So the impact of coercive control, I feel, is really, really important. And with the Strong Beginnings and the packages that I offer, we focus on that, because I feel employers don't really understand coercive control or where we're coming from. So I found a job after I was sacked. I was sacked a couple of times from jobs, and it was a massive trigger, because I was in an office space again, which is what I did when I met him, before I met him. But the boss I worked for at that time, again, it's kind of, "Oh, no, we can't see any visible injuries, you're fine, you've turned up to work."
Can't see it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so important we have these conversations. Just because somebody looks okay doesn't mean that they are. And because it has a huge impact on life, it's really, really important that we do talk about coercive control.
Absolutely. I mean, God, there's about a million things I want to ask you now because so much came out of that. And I hope I can remember it all. But one of the things you said at the start, and thank you very much for sharing, obviously, because I never take for granted when somebody shares their own lived experience that if anybody who's watching or listening, you know, for you to do that means you're having to go back in your own mind. And as you're talking, it's coming into your mind and you're thinking of certain things. And that, you know, in itself is so incredible that you can do that. And you're in a position, like you say now, where you are taking care of your own mental health and putting your needs, you know, where they should be, forefront of your life, and still be able to help others. And I think one of the things you said very early on that really struck me, and I only mentioned this to somebody yesterday, was people don't go into abusive relationships knowing that it's an abusive relationship. They don't walk in going, you know what, I know this is going to end badly, but I'm still going to do it anyway. That's not how it works. If you knew that these relationships, if people knew that these relationships were abusive, you wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. But that's the awful thing, is that society, you know, has still this blame and shame culture of, well, you chose to be with them. You made that decision, you know, you put yourself in that situation. No, you didn't, because when you met that person, they were very charming, they were very, you know, caring, they were very loving, they were everything you were looking for. And they play that part very, very well until the mask starts to slip. But then it is all, you know, we're back to this kind of trauma bonding, aren't we? Of once the apology comes, once the, well, you know, I was in a bad mood, I was having a bad day, it's your fault, you wound me up, whatever it would be. You know, it's, nobody would ever choose to be in that situation. And I think that's a really important point that people need to understand. And, you know, when you were talking, and coercive control is something that, you know, we hear these words and this terminology banded around a lot, but do people really understand what it means? And as you say, I think sometimes it's harder because there isn't the physical evidence, if you like. But that's why we need to take that time to learn to understand what coercive control means, because now, you know, we are, thank God, we're starting to talk about the mental health aspect along with domestic abuse, and coercive control is part of that. And of course, you know, somebody said to me a while ago, I never thought of mental health and domestic abuse in the same sentence. I was like, how can you not?
Yes,
you know,
yeah, they go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, but if you're being psychologically abused, it is going to have that impact. You know, and you said something really powerful then, and it's something I've come across a lot, is when the perpetrator will do everything to put you down and say, you know, you're stupid, you're fat, you're thick, you're this, you're that, you're that, which, by the way, you look gorgeous, your hair's fabulous, you have this absolute aura about you, which is just, I could just squeeze you, give you a big hug if I could. And that's the thing, you know, you have all of that. And I think sometimes a perpetrator feels very threatened by the victim and survivor because they have all these beautiful qualities, because they are kind, caring, considerate, you know, loyal to sadly to a fault. And they feel threatened by that. So they want to pull that apart. They want to call you every name so that you then start to believe it, because there's that quote, isn't there, in the Pretty Woman film, where she says it's the bad stuff's easier to believe, you know, and we all do that. 10 people could tell you look fabulous. One person says, oh, I look like this, or I feel like it. Then you're going to listen to that one negative comment. And it's human nature, sadly. But if we can get past that and say, actually, okay, I am an amazing individual, I am doing amazing things, I have come so far. And another brilliant point you made was, you know, there will be the good days and bad days. And again, it's so important that as society, we understand the reality of abuse, because we can't give this wishy-washy, you know, idea of what it is. You know, it isn't all going to be plain sailing if you manage to leave the situation, and not everybody does. But if you manage to leave, then it is going to get harder. It will escalate. Family courts will get involved if there's children, because the perpetrator will go down that road. Children's services, they will do whatever they can, like you said, to try and regain that control. And it's so important that people understand, and as a society, we understand that it will get harder. Absolutely, it will get harder. But if you keep going, have your bad days, accept those bad days, and then start again the next day and keep going and keep trying, because eventually you will get to that point where you can start to see a brighter future. and there is that hope. And it might only be the slightest little thing that happens on one day that will just change everything. But unless you know, if you don't keep trying, you're never going to know, are you?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, just touching on a few things you said there. I often say we don't fall in love with a caring partner, we fall in love with a controlling perpetrator. And then before we know it, we don't know any different. So when I met him, he wasn't controlling at all, as I said at the beginning. So you don't know any different. And it's only when you're in that situation and in that relationship that those cracks start to appear. But because they've manipulated you and wore you down psychologically, you're not strong enough. I was never strong enough to put the coercive control and the physical violence together, because I didn't see or feel the coercive control. So it's really, really difficult to kind of put those two together. And domestic abuse and coercive control is not pink and fluffy. It's not all about love. It's there's nothing romantic about it at all. But there are good days, and it does get better. So for anyone who's listening, I think one of the key messages for me would be, remember, it's not your fault. Perpetrators choose to abuse. Nobody chooses to become a victim. No, I never went out that Friday night and thought, you know what, I'm going to meet a guy and I want him to treat me, you know, really horrifically. We don't do that. And as you've mentioned, we get victim blaming, like, oh well, why didn't you just leave? But if it was that easy, trust me, I would have left many moons ago. And then we do leave, and then we do go back again. That is part of the cycle. I left several times before I left for good. And that's because, here's that word, love. We fall in love with that really nice person, that caring, kind person, and then they promise us they're going to change. You know, I love you, really, it won't happen again. I'm not going to be able to cope without you. And because we love that person, we think, okay, another chance. And then you go back and things will be okay for a while, and then the cycle will start again. And because you're isolated, it's so hard to break that cycle when you're on your own. It's impossible, because you're so embarrassed, you're so ashamed. And we shouldn't feel that way. That should fall at the feet of the perpetrator. They should be held accountable for their actions, because a survivor of domestic abuse has done nothing whatsoever for that perpetrator to treat them that way, even though they tell us, oh, you shouldn't have said that if you hadn't done that. But no, domestic abuse happens because abusers choose to abuse. And I think society as a whole need to kind of understand that, because, and that's why we have to do what we do with raising awareness, to give a clearer picture of what domestic abuse and coercive control is like. And I just want to say, I ran a campaign back when we had lockdown. I remember when good old Boris did his announcement when we were going into lockdown. I remember sitting there watching the TV and I just burst into tears, because that was a massive trigger for me. Because ideally, well, not ideally, but when I was in that situation, you could say I was in lockdown with the perpetrator, because I couldn't go anywhere other than shopping. And now we've got our Prime Minister telling us the same. And then I also thought about all the other men and women who were in that situation when we did have COVID and lockdown. And I set up a campaign called MTAB, which stands for More Than a Bruise, because again, I wanted to focus on coercive control. And we had Lady Karen Brady, we had Amanda Redman, Matthew Wright, and a few other celebrities who let us use their picture, and then we put a quote at the side, kind of highlighting what coercive control is. And I had so many people contact me saying, I didn't know I was in that situation. I didn't realise this was domestic abuse. And it's about having those conversations, and that's what Stronger Beginnings is about. It's about you and I and me and agencies and businesses having this connection and this stronger beginning, so we can raise that awareness and work with survivors and put them at the heart of everything that we do. Because if we do have those stronger beginnings and those connections, we can start to work towards eradicating coercive control and domestic abuse. If we don't talk about it and shy away from it, we're just letting perpetrators carry on. We're just letting people, you know.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, again, something you just said then that's so important as well is, so often people don't know that it's abuse. You know, people are contacting you saying, I didn't realize in that situation. And that's exactly the point, is because it's become your normal. That's your life, you know. And like you said earlier, you had nothing to compare it to. And what's really so tragic about things like that is then I have seen it happen is somebody will then go into another relationship and they think that that person is being caring and protective, whereas actually they're being possessive as well, because they haven't kind of done the work, if you like, and the understanding for themselves to know that actually these types of people are the people that want to use power and control, and they'll use it in very subtle ways in the beginning until they know that they've got you in the situation they want you in, and then they won't be so subtle anymore behind closed doors. My mum always has this brilliant saying, and she calls perpetrators street angels, house devils. And I just think it's absolutely amazing, because I think that's it, you know, what goes on behind closed doors. And because people don't recognize it, and sometimes I found myself in situations, if you know, I've heard somebody say, oh well, just, you know, somebody about abuse in terms of, well, I can't understand why you went, you know, married that person, or you dated that person, or whatever it be. And you find yourself thinking, but how do you know that you're not in an abusive relationship? What work have you done to find out about it? And again, it's this misconception, isn't it? I was asked a question yesterday about what are the misconceptions about abuse, and I said very much that it affects only certain people. No, it doesn't. Anyone can be a victim. You know, anyone can be a survivor, and it can happen to anyone. So we need to step away from this idea that only certain people are a target. No, they're not. A perpetrator will perpetrate, as you said, will choose to perpetrate in any situation, in any given relationship. So it isn't a case of it looks a certain way. And again, you know, when we use the term domestic violence, which is obviously very valid and for very valid reasons, but sometimes that gets misconstrued with domestic abuse. And yes, domestic violence is part of abuse, but that's where we need to say, but abuse is a much broader picture than people realize, you know. And usually you find that it's not just one aspect that you experience. There are several aspects of abuse. It could be the coercive control, it could be the financial abuse, you know, the sexual abuse. There's so many other things. And that's why we've got to do what we're doing and keep talking about it, and say it's all right to talk about it, because
yeah,
it's
absolutely, it really is. And again, just following on what you've said, the MTAB campaign is highlighting all those other forms of abuse as well. So it's all about power and control. Domestic abuse is all about power and control. So if you take out the physical violence, you're not minimizing the physical violence, but if you just take that out of the equation and you think of everything else, as you say, you know, financial abuse, coercive control, sexual abuse, those are all parts of domestic abuse. So we've like got an umbrella. So we've got domestic abuse at the top and then all these horrific forms of abuse underneath. But I think sometimes, because it's easy for society to do so, they focus purely on physical violence, and then we lose everything else. We don't see the bigger picture. We're just seeing it from one angle, and we need to kind of shift our camera and see it from all angles so we can get that better understanding. And the reason we need that is because you probably know lots of people who've experienced it. I know, we all know somebody who's been impacted and affected by coercive control and domestic abuse at some point, whether you're male, female, young, old, rich, poor. And as you've said, we shouldn't be embarrassed or shy away from these conversations, because it's happening right now as we're sitting here talking. There is somebody out there who's experiencing this, and they're feeling shame and embarrassment and don't know who to turn to. So we have to keep having these conversations for all those people who are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Yeah, perfectly said. It is, you know, there should be no blaming yourself. There should be, and that's the sad thing. And it's those things that you know, you need those support services out there so that you can say, okay, so now I want to try and understand what's happened, and work on your self-confidence, work on your self-worth, because you're never going to be the same person you were prior to, you know, to meeting that you were who you were, then the abuse occurs, and if you are fortunate enough to leave the situation, then you are somebody else with all this kind of, you're a whole new version of yourself. But actually it's not a bad version, and I've said over the years to people, it's not, it's a version of you that has experienced all of that, and you've learned from all of that. And you do find, you know, the majority of people who work around domestic abuse or within it have either been impacted directly, or a family member's experienced it, or a friend, or, you know, and it's really affected them to the point that they wanted to make that difference. And I think, again, you know, like you said before, with family, friends, work colleagues, what you experience in the workplace is beyond despicable. You know, it's absolutely disgusting. And all it did was perpetuate in your mind that they were right, that the perpetrator was right, because you weren't getting that help and support. And how many people are sitting in an office now? You know, if we talk about statistics, I mean, we know there's so many people who don't report, so we never really have a clear picture, do we? But there are so many people sitting in offices right now, or working in, you know, your local supermarket or wherever it is, who are experiencing abuse and probably don't even realize it, and their family and friends might notice it. But how do you support without damaging that relationship? Because, you know, again, something I will always say is you can't force somebody into seeing the abuse, and if they aren't ready to accept what they're experiencing is abuse, then what does a family or friend do? You know, all you can do is be there. I did an episode recently with a psychotherapist called, well, she's a life coach as well, called Sari Taylor, and she was saying if she was in that situation, and she has been in that situation before, is she would make herself available, you know, be contactable, be ready to listen. And it's the hardest thing in the world, I think, to do, but that could just make all the difference for that person to go, you know what, I feel comfortable enough to talk to you about this. Because it's that trust, isn't it? That lack of trust where it's gone. You know, you can't trust because you've been so horrifically abused. But then slowly, if people start to show that, you know, mutual respect, you may feel okay enough to say, okay, I trust you enough with this to tell you, don't think I'm stupid. Please don't think I'm an idiot, but what do you think about this? And it's friends, family, work colleagues, just knowing. And like you say, what you're doing with the work you do is so important for organizations to understand and say, okay, right, maybe I don't understand it fully, but now I've got a bit of a better picture as to what I need to do. Yeah, it's amazing.
Absolutely. Again, it's things like this podcast, Dip In and Out with Lucy, it's really, really important, because people who are in that situation, they can listen to it in their own time and a safe space. Again, we're raising awareness all the time, but it's just making society as a whole aware of what's available out there, because as you've said, it's really hard. I get lots of people ask me, oh, how can I support my brother or my sister? And it's really hard to say, well, actually, you've got to wait for them to come to you, because if we go to them, we could put them in more danger, in a worse situation than they're in. So things like this are making a huge difference. We also just want to add, I'm also an ambassador for IDA, Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. So because of the way I was treated back in the early 2000s, I share my story with employers and how not to support a survivor of domestic abuse when they make a disclosure. Again, it's really important to have these conversations, because bosses and staff, they don't understand the cycle, and if no one's having those conversations in the workplace, how can we start those conversations and raise that awareness? So things like what we're doing and promoting, and especially services that are out there, we are all raising awareness for when people are ready to make that disclosure, and for when people are ready to support others as well.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, the fact that you are talking to employers, it's fantastic, because it's so needed. And, you know, the irony of me calling it Dipping and Out with Lucy was I like the dip because it was like discussion, inclusion, progression, hopefully one day. But I purposely didn't put domestic abuse in anywhere, because I want to protect those people who may want to listen to it when they're around, if they're fortunate enough that they can go out and go and visit a friend, or like you say, be in the supermarket, you could be walking around listening to it, you know, use a different device if you needed to, whatever it would be, because I didn't want to, you know, I'm trying to put myself in that mindset and go, actually, you know, it isn't clear sometimes. Maybe that's not so positive that it's not clear what my podcast is about. But if you do know what it's about, then that kind of resonates. And it's like, well, yeah, at the moment, we're not in a position where, you know, people can necessarily have that displayed all over. That hopefully one day we will.
Yeah.
But at the moment, for me, it's about protecting that person that wants to be able to get that information and listen to something and think, or a family or friend listen and go, oh my God, right, I get that. That's exactly what my brother, sister, mother, father, whoever is experiencing. And now I need to know that I can go and find those places, those resources, that support. And I think, so what would, if you had to give a biggest takeaway, and I was asked this yesterday, was if anybody was listening now, or they were in obviously the position, or they thought they were in the position of being in a domestically abusive situation, what would be the kind of one piece of advice you would give to that person?
I think the biggest thing is it's not your fault. I think that's a massive piece, because you believe that for a very, very long time. You often believe it in that situation, and you believe it when got the strength and courage to escape that situation. So it's definitely not your fault. And also there is support out there. I was in that situation and I was never given a helpline number, never given anything at all. So you do genuinely believe that you're on your own and that you're the only person who's ever gone through this. So it's about knowing that you're not alone and you're not on your own, and that there is support out there, and also that there is life after domestic abuse, that you will get through it, that you can survive without that perpetrator. And I loved your description earlier about the person we become. If I'd never had that experience, I would not be sitting here now with you discussing this, that I've had some fantastic opportunities. I've met some amazing people who would never have been part of my life if I'd never gone through what I went through. So sometimes it's really hard, but you have to kind of swings and roundabouts. You have to kind of weigh up the good and bad. But life does get better, life does get easier, and you will most definitely survive without that perpetrator in your life, no matter what they say to you.
I love that. That's perfect. And I think you couldn't have summed it up any better. And what I would always say is, obviously, depending on who's on, if they have any links to websites, and you do, I'll make sure they get popped on the resources page as well. So if anybody wants to go and have a look at what Sam's doing, then they can find out a bit more about it and hopefully, you know, learn a bit more and understand. But Sam, I can't thank you enough. And I do think we could talk all day.
Definitely.
We had a good 20 minutes before.
We'll have another 20 minutes after. It's all good. All about raising
we'll go make a brew now and have a recap. Oh, thank you so much. And I genuinely I'm in awe of you. I am. You're an incredible person. You really are. And you are making huge differences in so many lives. And yeah, amazing person. I'm very honored to have had you on.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity as well.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks,
See you soon.
Bye.
Where